Welcome everybody to this session on rethinking behaviour change. My name is Ruth Larbey and I work at the University of the West of England in the Science Communication Unit there. And I'm also involved in the Committee for Communicate Conference, supporting the work of Savita, Matt, Stu and the fantastic team who produced Communicate. So for this session, I'd like to introduce Dr Kris De Meyer, who returns to Communicate this year after a fascinating session last year's Communicate. Kris is a neuroscientist and science communicator working at King's College London, whose work looks at how we believe and how beliefs become entrenched and polarized. And you've helped lots of other people to communicate more constructively about controversial environmental topics such as climate change as well. So I know that you've had lots of interesting things come out in the last few years. I've most recently seen your TEDx talk, and you've had the Climate Curious podcast as well, which is really interesting. So we're set up for what will be hopefully a very interesting and useful session today, and we're going to start with a bit of a kind of bilateral conversation between Kris and myself for the first 20 minutes or so, and then we're going to jump into a much more interactive part of the session where we'll gather some sort of stories from you and hopefully put a bit of learning into practice as well. But please do be posting your comments in the chat and your questions, and we'll see how many we can get to. So let's get into it. So I'll just start straight away with a question, which is, for a few years now, Kris, we've been pursuing in the environmental communication space a bit of an idea that injecting emotion into our stories is the key to engage people and get them to change behaviour or to act. Is this enough?
Wow, that's a very meaty question to start with. So on the one hand, emotions are really important for us personally in how we are making sense of things. But when it comes to thinking of emotions as drivers of action, that is a much more complex and nuanced question. And so there isn't a simple yes or no answer to are emotions enough or are they good to drive action? Because emotions are very unpredictable drivers of action, and whether they lead to action or behavior change is very much dependent on the context and on the problem that you're communicating. And what is often missing on environmental issues and climate change in particular is an ability to act. And if you don't have that ability to act, either if you don't feel you have the opportunity to act, or you don't feel you have the skills to be tackling a certain problem, you've got that sense of, what can I be doing about this? I'm just me, and it's a much bigger question than what I'm doing. Then you can try to pull those emotional cords of people as much as you like. It is not going to lead to action in a predictable way. And so whereas actions are to me, they're much more a sign, a consequence of the fact that you've managed to get through with your story, with your communication to another person. They are not necessarily something that is a foolproof way for you to get people to act. And you can make people feel scared or sad or angry or hopeful, and it having very different consequences for these different people that are perhaps experiencing the same emotions. And so rather than, if you think of how this works in, just jotting down my email because I heard it was making some beeps. If you think of how this works in real life, in when we're not trying to communicate, oops, and that's a phone ringing, that wasn't meant to happen. So if we're thinking of how our actions and our emotions are linked together, is that emotions are often a consequence of us doing something. And it's when we've done something, we feel that emotion, and that tells us something about the action we've just done. But so often, rather than thinking of emotions as driving behavior, we should think as emotions as the consequence of the things that we've done. And that brings us to one of the concepts that I was talking about last year as well. The session that you mentioned last year was about turning around the conventional wisdom and to say, well, actually, it's our actions that drive our beliefs. Our actions drive our mental states, our opinions, our attitudes, our emotions, and everything else that you can think of as a term that we're using for this. And so this is a slide that I asked a graphic designer to make me a picture to really drive that home, to help us understand that the actions are the active part in whatever we are doing as human beings, and our mental states, then being belief, concern, emotional states, they're the consequences of the things that we are doing.
Yes, I see. So it's not a link directly between we can trigger some emotions and then somebody will change their action. It's more about the actions driving, as your graphic so clearly shows here. So I want to ask a little bit more about this gap. So we've known about this gap between environmental attitudes and environmental behaviours or environmental actions for a very long time, actually. So since the late 1970s at the latest, we've been thinking about there is a gap between what we think about the environment and what we're actually doing. So why do you think that we have been struggling with this gap for such a long time now?
That's a really good question. So indeed, in environmental psychology, which is a branch of psychology that predates a lot of the current research that is happening in the communication of climate change and other environmental issues, environmental psychology existed already in the 60s and 70s. And what studies started to show, and something what is called a meta-analysis, which is where you put lots of studies together and then look at the effects at an aggregate scale. What these studies started to show is that indeed there is a value action gap, or an attitude behavior gap, or an intention behavior gap, as these are called in different parts of the psychological community. And so experimentally, we've known about that since the 1970s, but we keep on forgetting about this, and we keep on going like, oh, if only we could speak to people's values, if only we could get them to change their attitudes, if only we could get them to feel something, to care about whatever it is that we want them to care about, then behavior will follow. And the main reason for that, in my opinion, is that the conventional wisdom that we need to change an attitude to get us to change our behavior is very much ingrained in our thinking, in society, in the practices that the community of communicators has taken on over the years. So we've developed a practice, and that practice has incorporated as a conventional wisdom that care, concern, belief in, hope or fear can all be drivers of behavior. And of course we've got lots of anecdotal evidence. We've got lots of stories of people who felt something and then they went away and they acted, they did something, they changed their behavior. And that the anecdotes fuel our common sense, that conventional wisdom, that's the case. But what is happening is that often people who have a strong emotional response to something and then go and do something have already gone through a prior process where they started to do something, and that first doing got them engaged more deeply, more strongly with the issue that we're talking about, be it climate change or another environmental issue. So, and what we forget is that often that state of passionately believing in something, that has been preceded by something else. And so we fall then in the trap that that snap picture of where we are in that moment, where we feel something and then we go out and act. We want to then replicate that by communicating about our own concern and our own care, thinking that will then also help other people to act. But before that can work for those other people, they need to find their way into that through their own journey of actions leading to understanding and awareness and an emotional response and further actions and so on and so forth.
See, so it's it's highlighting a little bit some of the traps of memory, you know, some of the things that how we remember things maybe is slightly misleading sometimes.
Yes.
So that's great and fascinating. I'd like to talk a little bit about identity now. So we know by now, or we should know, that as consumers, we should be taking actions for the environment, for climate change. We've also recently seen a bit of an uptick of attention to the identity of activists. So with XR, with Greta, and some of these in this session also might identify with that term, the activist. So somebody who campaigns for change in some way. And the discourse of climate action, for example, has been largely played out on those two identities, really. But that doesn't really cover a wide range of identities. So how could you tell us a little bit or expand on how we in this group could maybe expand the current dominant meaning of climate action? And what does that have to do with identity?
Yes. So what you're saying is absolutely hitting home with me, because about a year ago in King's College, King's College has a little science museum, and they ran an exhibit on anxiety, eco-anxiety. And in that exhibit, we asked visitors two questions: how are you feeling about climate change, and what are you doing about this? And the reason for asking those questions was indeed to see that connection between people's feelings and the things they are doing. And so on the feeling side, I'm going to make that really short there. The word that most often came up was powerless. I feel powerless. So I feel an inability to act on climate change. And in the question, in response to the question, what are you doing about it? I would say that 98% of the responses that we had were consumer actions, and about a large proportion of them had to do with waste and packaging and plastics. And they're, of course, part of the mix of environmental problems, but they're not really having a massive impact on climate change. So it's kind of, people were conflating all of the issues together, the packaging and the waste and the climate change thing. But so 98% of those responses were sort of consumer actions, and that really struck me, because I was expecting at least a little bit more than a little bit of places where people had discovered other ways of bringing climate change into their lives. But it seems that our capitalistic consumer society is so strong that it pervades us so much that we can only think of climate action in anti-consumerist terms. So we're actually still thinking in the same framework which consumer society gives us. And that was an eye-opener a little bit. I'd expected it to be high, those consumer actions, but not roughly 98%. And the remaining 2%, by the way, was the bit of that activist identity that we have seen, where people said, I'm a member of XR, I've joined the school strikes and those things. But that, of course, that leaves all of these other areas in life out of the picture. And we don't only have an identity as a consumer or an activist. We have identities in the job roles that we have, the professions that we hold. We are members of a community. We go to a church. We're part of a school community if our kids go through a certain school. We may be part of community groups, and so on and so forth. And all of those other identities at the moment, we don't feel like we can bring climate change into the activities and the actions that we are undertaking as a parent of kids who are going to a school, as a church member, as someone working in a certain professional role. And that's because in psychology, there's a very useful concept called agency, which is to describe that having a sense of knowing how to act, having an ability to act. And we have a lot of agency in all of the identities that we hold. So if you are a nurse or a doctor working in the health service, if you are a farmer, if you are a truck driver, whatever profession you do, you have agency within that profession. You know how to do that. But what we're seeing in all of the conversations that we have and all of the work that we're doing is that people find it really hard to bring climate change and decisions about climate change into those identities that we're holding in the other parts of our lives. So for instance, we've recently been running a training program for organizational development consultants, where those are people that help businesses and organizations to develop themselves, to develop the structure. And I'm a bit distracted. There's a squirrel on my window ledge at the moment who comes and looks all the time. He peeps his head above the thing. I can't show him, he's too fast. But so we've got that. So we did that training, and at the beginning of the training, all of those people, we knew that they had a personal concern about climate change, but they didn't know how to bring it into their professional identity as a consultant. They didn't know how to start these conversations with their clients, with their customers, with the councils or the NHS organizations that they're working with. And so we took them through a process of developing their agency, of finding how do you bring those conversations about action on climate change into your professional identity. And it's worked. So at the end of the program, which finished a short while ago, people are now saying, like, we've started to have those conversations, and you know what, it works, and our customers aren't freaked out by it when we bring this into the mix. They're actually responding very positively to it. And so that was just one example of how we are trying to allow people to bring their other identities, to connect that to the concern that they are feeling about climate change. Because it's only when you create agency in that specific identity that emotions can lead to some useful behavior. So that's when concern then can channel itself, can find its way in like a riverbed almost, and can find its way in a useful direction to start creating action within the constraints that you have in that role or that identity.
That's really interesting about how to enlarge the space for having agency. So on all of our different identities as parents, as workers in various sectors. So I'd like to drill down a little bit more into kind of how to operationalize, really. What kinds of things could you tell us? For people in this session, we're in all kinds of different areas, in journalism, in scientific areas, in policy areas, in media, from many different walks of professional life. And we're all kind of dealing with an increasingly polarized space as well. And so could you tell us of any particular ways that we can operationalize action-based communication in our work?
Yes, that's an excellent question again. So I think because this is a Communicate conference, I'll focus on the communication first. And what we have been doing for a long time is communicate about climate change and environmental issues as issues. We've tried to raise the awareness, try to explain the issue, the problem. And by doing so, we've managed to, if we've done it well, if we've built emotions into our communication, then we've managed to create emotions in the public. But that hasn't necessarily led to the action that then we were expecting out of that. So what we have started to work on is to really reframe the stories we are telling about climate change away from trying to explain it as an issue, but try to explain it through the actions that people are taking to tackle that particular issue. So for climate change, that would mean that we need a wide range of stories of all of these different groups of people with their different identities, with their different practices that they have, and to tell the stories of how these communities of practice, as we call them, these communities of people who are used to doing things in a certain way, how they are discovering their own agency in climate change. So stories of people taking action to avert a problem are serving two purposes. The first one is that they're actually much better at explaining the issue than if you try to explain the issue. And that sounds counterintuitive again, but it is because our social brains, the brains that deal with other people and other individuals, animals and trees and whatever, are sort of also can be triggered by our social brain, or our social brain can deal with individuals, basically. But what happens is that stories about people go into our social brain, and that's like the wide gate, the big gate at the front of our head almost. Whereas if you try to explain an issue in abstract terms, like climate change or other issues of environmental degradation, it's like a little side door at the side of your head. And with that, I'm not saying that the social brain sits here in the front and the issue brain sits here in the right. That's not the case that I'm making. What I'm saying is that there's a royal road into the brain, and then there's a tiny secret door almost, and we're constantly trying to go through that secret little door, and we're getting sort of clogged up in that, whereas we're forgetting that it's stories about people doing things that are not only effective in us understanding them and understanding why they're doing things, but are also usually the ones that trigger emotions in us. So it's kind of like it ticks all the boxes if we're telling stories about people. But if we're telling stories about people dying or people suffering, that's not leading to action. That's where the second point comes in. If we want people to learn from other people's sense of agency, the other people's way that they discover how to act on climate change, then we need stories of people taking action. And then we can learn from them how they are doing it. And one brilliant example actually is, if you think of Greta Thunberg, if you listen to how she talks about her first climate school strike, is she was sort of inspired by the actions of the teenagers in Florida that were protesting against a school shooting. And so she saw them having that agency, and she took their agency and she turned it into her own practice. So it's not that she worked it all out in her head and then went to do it. No. She saw other people doing it, and she brought that into her own behavior and her own practice.
That's super. That's fascinating. Just this kind of, it would represent quite a shift in a way from an issue-based discourse to a more action-based discourse. So I'd just like to pick up on this idea of creating action with just a final question before we get into the next segment, which is, it's to do with this idea. For example, when you're trying to make a behavioural change, or you're trying to kind of inspire a behavioural change, for example, active travel rather than using your car. I know lots of people who don't have a car. They've never had a car. They don't even see the need for a car, even with all the responsibilities of life and, you know, kids, etc., or shopping. And I see a lot of people in the same situation who already have a car and don't necessarily see it's possible to live without that car, which two different ways of looking at this same thing. I mean, this can be expanded to other examples as well. Could you share any insights with us on how people really could move from one mode of action to another?
Yes, so that's if you want to make that actions drive beliefs work for you, if you want to help go on that journey so that you can discover your own agency in this, then you've got to do that in a way that fits with your identity and who you are and the agency you have. And I'll just give one example of someone that I was speaking to about a year ago. She's the head of comms of a large organization, and she doesn't. I was talking to her about actions drive beliefs, and she said, "Oh, that's how it worked with me. I have an example of that." A year ago, she said, I started to walk to work because I felt I wasn't doing enough exercise, and I felt that I really needed to do more to keep myself fit. So I started to do that every day, 1 hour in, 1 hour out. And at the same time, I needed to start working more and more on climate change because that's part of my responsibility. I needed to put some comms out about climate change. So as I started to do this walking, I started to reinterpret my own walking behavior through a pro-environmental lens. And that led me to think of it as like, oh, I'm doing something good for the environment. And you know what she said? I've now just recently sold my car. And that's because she personally developed that sense of agency. She started doing the walking, not for environmental reasons first. Then she developed that sense of agency, but also that reinterpretation. So her actions were changing her beliefs about what she was doing. And then she's got that agency where she says, you know, I don't really need that car anymore, so I'll sell my car. And that's how we all have to discover that for ourselves. And we will need, in addition to trying to put ourselves or trying to help other people go on that journey of the discovery of their own agency, we may need society to be restructured a little bit around us. Because if you're living in a part of the country where you really do need that car because you can't, you're living 5 miles from somewhere or whatever, no matter how much you're going on that behavior discovery or agency discovery cycle, you might not get there. But it might be that if you're living in a situation, you're living in a context where something is being made possible for you. So now all of a sudden there is a new technology that allows you to dial a car to come and pick you up, a self-driving car to come and pick you up whenever you need it, then you don't need your own car anymore. And that's just one example. I know that we need many more bits and pieces of restructuring society and the world around us to make this happen. But a lot of our behaviors are driven not by what's in our head, but what's in the world around us. And if a car, if you get the sense that using that car is the best or the only way that you can get around with all the constraints that you have of kids or shopping or moving or all of those things, then no matter how much you're concerned about the climate, it might not change your behavior. And that's again another example of how then that concern doesn't lead to behavior, because you don't know how to square that concern with all of the other pressures that you feel in life.
Yeah, so it's about getting that first step on the path, that first action, which in the example you gave, it seems like it's a self-reinforcing kind of thing.
Yes, so I call that the self-persuasion, and it comes from a group of psychologists, social psychologists, who use that term self-persuasion in the 1950s and 60s, but that really is what it is. It's like going on that cycle where you develop a deep engagement with something, you persuade yourself of the importance of it. It's not other people doing it, it's you yourself doing it. And yes, you're relying on information coming from other places, but you are still doing it yourself. It happens inside your head with the support of the people around you and with the support of the world around you, the material world around you.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, so that was all fascinating, but I'd really like us to have the chance for the wider group to operationalize some of the understandings that we've just been talking about, that actions really drive belief. So we wanted to give you an opportunity for you all to explore your own actions in this session. So we're going to ask you to tell your own story. Kris, would you like to introduce what you'd like people to do?
Yes, so this actually, the first time we really did this was last year in Communicate. We ran an exercise in which we asked people, tell us about an action that you've done in the past that then later you reinterpreted as pro-environmental, to help people understand from their own experience how this had worked for them in the past. And my question now is a little bit different. I'd like you to go back to the very first thing you remember you did that you could think of as a pro-environmental action. And the reason for that is in the year between last year's Communicate and now, I've been asking that question of many people, and I've actually heard a lot of really interesting examples back. And so take a little bit of time to think about what was your first action that you remember that you took that set you on a journey that brought you here to Communicate in 2020. And put it in the chat, and then we'll pull a few people perhaps to tell their stories on the stage. What you have to do if you want to go and come and tell your story, share your story, is that you'll have to click the button share audio and video in the upper right corner of your screen. Now, while you're thinking about this and while you're perhaps writing this down in the chat, I'll tell you my own, or one of my own first actions. And that was when, in 2008, I was sitting in front of the TV, as we were still doing in those days, and I was zapping through the channels. And I by accident, I ended up on Channel 4 watching a documentary called The Great Global Warming Swindle. And it was a very polemic documentary full of climate skeptics that were saying, no, it's got nothing to do with humans. It's all the sun and natural variability and so on and so forth. And I was watching that and I was getting really, really angry when I was looking at that, because I thought, this is all nonsense. I don't believe what they're saying. But at the same time, I am thinking that this is actually a very effective, very persuasive documentary that will sow a lot of confusion in people's minds. And my action was linked to my identity and agency as a scientist. I wrote to the scientists in the documentary because as a scientist, that's what you know how to do. You know how to find their email addresses. You know how to send an email to them in a way that they will respond back to you. And so I had a conversation with quite a few of them. Some felt misrepresented, some felt not misrepresented, thought that it was a good documentary. But that was my first climate action. And again, very unusual one in that it wasn't to do with my own carbon footprint. I was responding from my identity as a scientist there. And another quick example before we go to Bea, who's joined us on the stage here. Another quick example is that in February this year, we were running an agency building workshop in Cornwall. And we had a group of 15 people from the community in that workshop. And somewhere in our 3 days that we were there, one of the participants comes to me and says, you know, that actions drive belief thing, I don't believe that. I've been an environmental activist for as long as I can remember, and that's how it works. You're very convinced, you convince other people of caring about things, and that's how it works for me. And I was like, okay, if it doesn't work for you, then there's nothing more I can say. But a couple of hours later, she came back to me and she said, I've just remembered my own first action. When I was 17, I was walking past a pond and I saw a duck drowning, and I jumped into the pond and I rescued the duck. And that evening, my parents wanted to take me to a Chinese restaurant to go and eat duck. And that was my first emotional red flag where I said, like, no, this is really, I'm not gonna join you. And then from there on, she became the very convinced activist. So that's enough for my stories. I see Russell joined us. Russell.
Hi, Chris.
Yeah.
How are you?
Hi. Good to see you again.
Nice to see you here. We did a session yesterday and basically did a tiny bit of all the things. So so I'm pleased that everyone here is here to see you today.
Cool.
So
would you like to tell us your story?
okay, so my mum used to read Woman's Own magazine, and there was like a double-page spread about how the blue whale wasn't going to survive until the year 2000, and this was in 1992. And so she gave it to me and was like, look at this. And I was like, what? I was like really like angry about that. I was age 11, and so I bullied two of my mates to do a sponsored bike ride, and we were 11, and I should probably hasten to add, I grew up in Dubai, so this was the height of the Dubai summer, and it was 48 degrees and like 100% humidity, and me and two of my mates cycled 30 miles and raised 600 dirhams, which is about 120 pounds. And I remember like that was the most amount of money I could ever imagine. And I sent it off to the World Wildlife Fund with "Save the blue whales, please," like attached to it. And well, the blue whales are still here, aren't they? So I like to think that it definitely did its job.
Excellent example.
That's really good. Yeah, that's brilliant. I don't know whether we want to bring up somebody else now, Stu, if there's anybody else who fancies. Oh, we've got an Alan. Hello, Alan.
Yeah, how's it going?
Hi there.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting what you said there, Chris, about how people start acting without realizing why they were acting. So what I'd posted up, first decision that, like, proper decision that I really consciously made as a semi-adult was choosing to travel back from Bristol to Northern Ireland via ferry rather than flying. And selfishly, that decision wasn't really based around carbon. That was because I could fit more stuff in a car than I could in a suitcase on a plane. But then from there, I sort of thought, oh, actually, maybe I can make decisions about my mode of transport or what I choose to do.
Excellent, excellent example again. So you see that it's all linked to our own context at that particular moment, right? Ruth, while we're waiting for someone else, what's your first action that you ever took in this way?
Sure, yeah. So I actually have, I was in your session last year, so I kind of prepared something already of thinking about this, but it took me a while to think back actually and just figure out what was that first kind of pro-environmental action. And I used to live in Hong Kong when I was a kid, and there was a swimming pool that was for the village kids that backed onto the forest. It was just like a little shallow swimming pool. And I remember every year there used to be forest frogs who would come and lay eggs in the swimming pool. And every year, some of the adults in the village would come and scoop out the eggs and put them on the grass to die because they had to sterilize the swimming pool for the kids. And I loved being in nature and that kind of thing, but I remember that was the first point at which I thought, is that really necessary? And so I guess that kind of the first action that I did was really through wanting to study what happened to them. If I collected up some of the spawn, put them in some water in a little tank and hatched them out. And so I was really into drawing the little tiny frogs as they developed. And so it was really that kind of having an object to study and draw that made me think, later on, yeah, it's so easy to kind of just dispose of this fragile hundreds of fragile little babies. And I suppose that was the first kind of self-reinforcing, self-persuasion action that I could think of.
Excellent, very nice example. And indeed, a lot of scientists and a lot of people in environmental organizations have entered through that way, where they did something in a natural context and that really stuck. And that perhaps brings us on to, and we're still open for if someone wants to join. Oh, great.
Oh, hello, Megan.
Can you hear?
Hello. We can, yeah. Would you like to tell us your story?
I'm just really inspired by everything that I've seen coming through the chat. So I thought I'd just, bite the bullet and share mine. So when I was 9 years old, as you can tell with my authentic British accent, I grew up in Canada and on the West Coast. And so when I was 9 years old, Greenpeace came and did a talk to the school about the waste of paper and the devastation it's doing to British Columbia's forests. And I was so inspired and angry, such a visceral emotional reaction to that I went home and started to lobby the BC's provincial government to input recycling programs into schools. And I'm happy to say, with some help of friends and family, District 23 was the first school to implement a recycling program. And that set me on my, I guess, lifelong passion for trees, because I do work for the Woodland Trust. And it was that moment, I can clearly define it as that moment when I realized, yes, the science of trees and their role and everything they do for us was the moment. And how do I communicate with that with the rest of the world?
Excellent.
That's another great example there. Thank you very much, Megan. That's really kind of talking to what you were mentioning before. And I've seen some other really good comments as well. I haven't been able to read all of them because it's been so interesting, but kind of the idea of not buying water in plastic bottles. Kathy Sykes, it's a combination of outrage that people could charge so much for water. So it's a kind of outrage and waste as well. So the costs of the waste. And now she's ended up somewhere where she's got a PhD in looking at biodegradable plastics. There's so many good examples here, and as you say, like people looking back on their experiences really brings this out, this kind of first action step.
Yeah.
So do you mind if I move on to a final question?
Yeah, go.
Or would you like?
Yeah,